So today I want to talk about the possibility of Debian perpetuating its own internal communications training among its own membership, and it doesn't need to be just Debian internal. It could be sistering with other, outside free and open source software communities who are also dealing with online communications and training each other. So it doesn't have to be just internal to Debian, but I want it to be Debian folks to really have an investment in it and be able to do it. And some of the examples that I'm drawing from are from community development of various sorts. Just an anecdote, I was looking for notes on such a group that I had set up for a co-housing community back roughly 2005 or 6. And when I look back at my notes this week, I saw that I had told them that they should learn from the software developers about issue tracking and that kind of thing. So those are my introductions. Let's see here. I want to talk about, I'm going to jump around a little bit from my original outline here. I was also going to mention that I was available for the anti-harassment team in Taiwan. That's just background, just to let you know that I have gotten involved with a few issues and seen what's going on from the inside in a number of ways. Plus, I've been paying attention to Debian since 2003. Something that came up when I was hearing the sessions the last day or two is when hearing about the communications team, I am looking at IRC. Nope, they don't need me. When thinking about the new communications team, which used to be the anti-harassment team, I am seeing that that team will need to become more formal, and meanwhile, while Debian becomes more important, the issues become more central stage, more legal issues become more crucial to the overall reputation. And I'm going to see that, I believe I'm going to see that communities team get more and more pushed towards a regulatory role. And by suggesting that there be more peer-driven communications training within Debian that's not from a judicial, decision-making, policy-setting group about what is and is not okay, have most of that nuts and bolts kind of work happening to help prevent those issues from coming up to that kind of level where you end up needing something equivalent to policy, technical policy decisions being made on the communications policy end, because that is coming up, that is needed, but the rank and file need to be able to self-facilitate. An example I have for that is a story from another community that I believe developers should be aware of, and it's large and it has a lot of literature, and that's helpful. And that is the secular use of Quaker consensus decision-making models. So I'm calling it secular consensus, secular Quaker, because it's not from the Society of Friends necessarily, and their spiritual communing that they do through, egalitarian speaking from inspiration. This is more about a nuts and bolts how to run consensus meetings and do policy setting and do governance of important organizations and large organizations through this kind of formal consensus. It'll be called a number of different things. Meanwhile, within that community, there's this idea called facilitating from the back benches. And facilitating from the back benches refers to someone who is not up front doing something that in Debian is usually called moderating. It's not somebody moderating up front. It's one or more people in the audience or from the circle who are asking questions and making comments that in fact facilitate the group. And you know, they didn't even need it. And what I had to tell them was, no, you actually didn't do the facilitating because you weren't, this is like a trial run for the training. And I said, actually, they saw that you weren't doing the steps that needed to be done, so they were doing it from the back benches. People were asking the questions, making the comments, and making the suggestions that everyone kind of sort of knew were legitimate things for a facilitator to say to keep the conversation going. So this is the kind of mass movement that I'm envisioning that Debian developers could help engender within their own communities. It won't be everybody. Computer technicians often, as a personality trait, prefer the clear, straightforward, or at least problem-solvable communications you get from a computer, and do not appreciate the thousands of different factors that need to be taken into account at once when you're dealing with real people. Dealing with real people is much more complex than a computer. So there will be people who are good at that, and they're not always very active in Debian now and might be in the future. So what I'm talking about is bringing those folks in Debian who are known for being better communicators and respected and appreciated and able to pass things on, at least by example, bringing them into circles of learners who are then passing that on. So here we go. So the concepts of facilitating from the back benches. Let's see, I'm opening my horrendously huge org mode file here. My apologies. Okay, so here are some examples that I've written that you won't try to read, I hope, of ways in which a group can be made self-perpetuating. So for example, so let's say you start with a small group. It's an affinity group style, meaning that these are people who have some affinity for each other. They can work with each other. It's voluntary. It doesn't have to be voluntary, but I'm picturing something that's voluntary because that will make a lot of the hurdles easier to deal with. And for Debian, it wouldn't make sense to be non-voluntary. Actually, wait a second, I'm going to back up. Voluntary is important because it allows the participants to support the group and know that each other are all trying to be helping each other. If you force someone to go through such a training, yes, you can force their presence, but you can't force their will to be nice and to help each other learn and get through this. So in the easiest ideal situation, I'm suggesting everyone be voluntary. People come in with, if they're all getting to, if it's rolling admission, it might be different, but let's say you're all starting at once and you're going to do a 1 month, once a week. So you're going to do a 4-session training and you're all starting in the first week. So I'm suggesting people could come in with their original stated concerns or interests, such as I have harassment concerns, or I have moderating skill concerns, or I'm wondering what are best practices in issue tracking communications, that kind of thing. So those interests are what guide that participant's study and also guide that participant's future contributions to the group. Trainers, you might bring in an outside trainer. I would suggest first starting with people who are considered good at communications training inside the community. But the trainer's role is to set up to hear those participants mention their interests and their concerns and point them to resources that they can study on their own. So it's a little bit of mentoring or tutoring to help those folks follow their own goals. Also, if everyone's starting at the same time, then that first session can include scheduling future dates. So the idea here, I'm getting really specific, but these things are very flexible. The point I'm making here is that folks are coming in, introducing themselves to each other, saying, this is who I am and what I'm interested in, but taking that not as an audience or a receptive student's perspective, but take that from, okay, this is an active participant that you're trying to take advantage of and make sure that their contribution helps this thing along, find out what they're interested in and get them, get their wheels on the road to actually getting traction and actually bringing back the results of their research into the group so we can learn from them. And then those presentations that they make later are just small presentations, maybe 10 minutes or less, depending on the context and the size of your training. But they're really just to get the conversation rolling and to point people towards resources that they've found, or maybe to get the group to talk about topic questions that they have about these things. Another thing to consider in this type of training is that you have rotating roles, that people are actually dog fooding the process. Someone's doing timekeeping, someone's doing note-taking, someone's actually the facilitator who has, somebody who has best experience available is the facilitator. A convener, which is somebody who actually makes sure the venue is available, whatever that would mean if it was online. So basically, you're splitting up a complex role into subparts so people can get experience with those small points. Because believe me, having to combine time tracking, scribing, note-taking, and calling on people and calling a meeting to order, those takes a huge amount of your brain and nervous system to do. So breaking those small things up so that people can practice. Now what I have is some content ideas, and let me see if I can find them. Okay, here. Can I get a time check here? Okay, I see it. So possible topics. So let's pretend again, you have a group of people who've decided, okay, there's only 3 to 5 of us, but let's try this and see if it works. Okay, here's a recommendation of how you might start. Let's say you're going to have 4 meetings. In your first session, you're just going to talk about big picture stuff. Why are we having the training, the importance, what kind of resources are we going to use, reading, videos, what have you, scheduling future events, and then talk about some philosophy, some theory, where is Debian in this stuff, why do we need it? And that way, because this topic is so broad, because all these 4 topics are so broad, people with their individual concerns can gear it towards what they're interested in. Maybe it's anti-harassment, maybe it's issue tracking forums, that kind of thing. Second session, concepts, vocabulary, that kind of thing. Third session, process. This gets more implemented. Now we're talking about how does Debian make decisions? How does it make technical decisions? How does it make personnel membership decisions? Whether someone's a developer or not, or loses their development status. These are kind of like nuts and bolts of how we actually do things. But it also should be about, in the best of all possible worlds, how do we make decisions? When I did these kinds of trainings, I would usually focus on this C.T. Butler's On Conflict and Consensus handbook, written in late 70s, early 80s. And he was encoding some secular Quaker process in terms of what he observed in activist groups at that time. So it's a very cookbook style book, and I will promise to put a post of that up somewhere. But what I would do is say, okay, this is Butler's version of the flow chart that shows, first you get the agenda set, you have introductions, you call for concerns, what have you. Those are details of that. On your 4th session, techniques, and then get into more of the specifics of, okay, now we know the overall process. What are things you do during different parts of that process? So how do you call a group's attention? How do you deal with people who are repeating themselves? How do you keep things on topic? How do you introduce topics? It's like a how-to for the things you talked about theoretically before. And then repeat that cycle. Perhaps you have an outside trainer that's been a consultant during this process, and maybe they'll stop after the 4 weeks. Maybe they'll continue on. Maybe you have some senior folks who've got a lot of history in Debian who promise to stick around for 4 weeks, but they're not going to go past 4 weeks. Or maybe, if you can, you'll have somebody continue for another cycle so people can learn how it is this cycle continues. And if you have rolling admission, that people can keep coming in. I don't want to spend a lot more time, unless people ask me to later, about about those nuts and bolts. I'd rather talk about the overall idea. And I don't want people to get too specific and say, this is the way we have to do it. I heard someone mention the Debian Academy idea. So here's something you could, a proposal you could put underneath that concept, that general idea. So places in which this kind of thing has worked well, Vagrant pointed out to me that that I had forgotten that Latin America has a strong reputation for these kinds of literacy trainings, getting huge amounts of the number of the population from illiterate to book reading in a small number of years. Because you allow people who have got some simply measurable amount of competence. Say your measure is this person has gone through the 4-session cycle twice. They're now being empowered to set up their own. Something as simple as that can cause replication, not just self-perpetuation, but replication where you have it branching off, lots of branching, in a way that is not a fork necessarily, meaning completely different project, but more of a supportive rolling out and delivery to a larger population. China did it quite successfully with barefoot doctors, getting herbal training out after decades of war, and were able to successfully get many people the kind of first aid and minimal health training they needed. The example that I was first made familiar with was in the 1970s, at a time when US and other European-style cultures had lost intergenerational knowledge about breastfeeding. So women were relying on medical doctors telling them that formulas were safer. And when that scientific education became clearly wrong, there was a large grassroots movement for women to train each other on how to breastfeed and raise children in a healthy manner. So an organization called La Leche League, which I believe is French, just did something exactly like this. In 4 sessions, you read a book together, and you had topics that were as equivalently broad as the ones I'm describing here. And after you had gone through a certain number of sessions, you might be empowered by the group to have the next set of meetings at your house. And this was, as far as I know, measurably connected to the very fast reuptake of breastfeeding as a practice in the United States.
I'm going to add an example from 2018 when I led an unrecorded session hoping to bring folks together that had some trauma around flame wars in Debian and show a way of talking about Debian process that would desensitize folks from that kind of pain. So the goal was to in the long term, build a tradition where folks could come together and share information about what works and what they could still use help with. So what I did is, with these goals, I gave 2 very, very short slides. Basically, I just said, we're going to pass the microphone around, and I would like you to finish one of these statements. Here are some ways in which you could tell stories. And I gave them these 4 examples of ways to start a short story to tell the group. And that we would not have discussion, we would merely hear from each other. Instead of telling a negative story, frame it in terms of possible ways to ask for help. So, for example, something that could be improved is, or we're not so good at, or our strengths have costs. Something we could improve is, we don't understand how other groups solve this type of problem. These are things that are not necessarily criticizing oneself, but are an opening up and looking for advice. So at the end of this session, in 2018, Taiwan, I found that folks were happy. They felt they had learned something. People who had been in the middle of some of those conversations didn't hear about some of the positive things that happened in out of the scenes. So while they were listening and reading Flame Wars, there was other stuff going on that they didn't hear about until this session. Also, another thing that happened in this session, and by the way, did I mention that there wasn't discussion until people had told their short stories? Only at the end we had discussion, but it was just a set of short little vignettes that people told about. Also, folks that had been in the middle of problems said, at least one person who had been in a conflict told me that they wouldn't have attended or contributed to a session on that topic if it had been recorded. Meanwhile, it went really well, and I think it could be done again in the future and recorded, and I think it could go very well. So that's all I had to talk about today, and I always have more, so let's do conversation. Okay? Or contact me. Thanks.
Thank you, Delib, for your talk. And now let's see some questions. Why did you write some audio is missing on your slide, warning us?
One of the slides said some audio is missing as a bullet point because I was not doing editing well enough to go and take that audio silence out or fill it. I just wanted to let people know not to give up and to realize that the sound would return.
Okay, so would you like to add something else?
Yeah, I really hope folks will notice that I've started a project on Salsa GitLab where I believe my workflow will best be served and allow others to contribute in a way that would work for me, and that is through a wiki, because this can be a very text-based project that I'm inviting people to be part of. Last time I gave a draft of this talk, I heard many questions about, okay, what do we do? Like, what do you think is the way to incorporate this into Debian? And I believe a really good way to start is to just ask people to contribute ideas to what could become a manual of how to train people about good communications. So it might be just, here's a communication piece of advice, but it could also then be organized in terms of this is how you teach it. So at the top of the Etherpad page, I provided a link saying here's an invitation, and it's called at salsadebian.org. It's under my username Delib, D-E-L-I-B, and the name of the project is just generic communications training. And what I'm doing is seeding it with pages that can describe, here's what it's expected on this wiki, here's some formatting ideas, here are sources we can work with, and just inviting people to create new wiki pages, put ideas in there, and then I feel that I'm good at organizing text and finding patterns in it and contributing. I like wikis because if I make mistakes, I don't persevere and try to make it perfect before I tell anybody, and try to keep it to myself until I'm ready for publication, which never happens. Instead, I can just put out there these, ideas in a way that a wiki is really good for.
Thank you very much, Delib.
Thank you. Is that all the time we have?
Yes, we have no more questions, so I think we have finished.
Okay. Thank you then. I hope to see you in that wiki or email me. I'm looking for collaborators on this project. I have a couple people who are interested who are not, one of them who is very qualified would be a guest account, and I'm letting her know that that's fine. So here we go. Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye, and thanks, everyone. See you tomorrow.